amazingly, in the book Netherlands Druglands, Bart de Wever, the mayor of Antwerp, stated that legalizing cocaine would be a plausible and genuine solution to ending the drug war. Coming from him, it's quite a surprise. This drug war has been raging in Antwerp for several years, as we know, following also the upscaling of the drug war by Bart de Wever. But Bart de Wever immediately added that he categorically refuses to even consider this solution that he himself presents as plausible and genuine. Do you think it's plausible that de Wever is worried about the conflicts between rival gangs in Antwerp and that he really wishes to end them? Is this his real motive?
Well, I can't see inside this man's brains and personal thoughts, but many of his expressions and statements in the media show this strange discrepancy and contradiction in what he's actually saying. Because if you, on the basis of scientific and evidence-based materials, you decide that a war on drugs cannot be won and that you are failing in tackling the drug problem, then the logically conclusion would be we have to do something else than a war on drugs. So saying I think legalizing is the best solution, but then on the ground continuing a war on drugs is a very strange contradiction. And I wonder if, I do think that many politicians around the world who are still embracing the repressive discourse and the prohibitionist logic basically know that this is not going to work, but that it's often part of a kind of a populist approach, which is a message that you can sell to a certain part of the population in telling them, I'm going to finally clean out this mess. I'm going to finally solve the problems. This is a problem created by the previous governments, but I will finally solve the problem and make sure I eradicate it. And this whole eradication hypothesis is something that people were told for decades, also on the international level. Yeah. As long as we invest enough in police and in justice and in this repressive war on drugs, we will finally manage to create a drug-free world. Now, that in itself is an illusion that people would should already know, that there is no such thing as a drug-free world. As I said before, there are drugs in this world and we like them, or many people like those drugs. And so these drugs will always be around and we will have to find a way to manage the phenomenon. And it's very strange for me to be able to sell this message continuously to a population, in the sense that he's saying, we're not winning the war, we actually will never win that war, but we have to do it on moral grounds. Now, I don't think a drug policy should be based on the moral grounds of individual politicians. I don't think this policy should be based on ideological considerations and values and norms of certain politicians. This is a debate on what works and on what does not work, and it should be evidence-based. After 50 years or 60 years of trying to do the same, we should be able to look each other in the eye and say, this is not working, and we know it's not working. So let's start thinking in a very, maybe even radical, different way in order to be able to tackle the problems that we see today.
Among the arguments in favor of regulation or legalization of cannabis and maybe other substances, there's always the desire to bypass the black market economy and drain the mafias of their profits. First, do you think it would be easy to do this? In other words, do you think that the mafias would just let this happen, especially in countries where they have infiltrated so deeply into state administration, the so-called narco-states?
No, it will not be easy, but to be honest, you have to separate the war on drugs and drug consumption and the war on mafia. Now, the war on drugs is something that does not work. And that we need to change. The war on mafia, the war on criminal networks is a war that you will have to continually wage in. So we have to fight criminal networks, professional criminals that exploit many vulnerable people in many different ways. So these criminal groups are targets that you will always have to fight. One part of your strategy to fight organized crime is exactly by taking away some of their profit margins or some of their opportunities to make so many profits. So regulating drug markets and taking away this huge opportunity to make a lot of money is just one element of fighting organized crime. And this is not an easy struggle, but you have to keep in mind that actually our policy makes organized crime even stronger by not only waging a war on organized crime, but also waging a war on drugs. We make the drug market enormously interesting in terms of profits for these groups. And most of the spectacular wars on drugs actually created more organized crime groups. In South America, in Latin America, there was a huge war on drugs inspired by the US and also financed by the US with billions of dollars and with the army sent in to try and destroy these cocaine cartels in Latin America. The result of that was that instead of a few large cartels, they created many smaller cartels who are also competing and very aggressive and violent against each other, but also the spreading of the phenomenon of organized crime over the Latin American country. So this war on drugs, Plan Colombia, so many years ago, actually made the organized crime phenomenon bigger and more powerful. And this is exactly the same thing what is happening nowadays with our war on drugs here in Europe and, for example, in our country. We are creating more profit opportunities for organized crime, so we are attracting more organized crime cartels and groups to this market. They will obviously compete and be very aggressive towards another and throw grenades and shoot guns and try to kill each other. But at the same time, they become more and more powerful. And the more powerful they become, the more they undermine our state. Organized crime, mafia, has always undermined the democratic structures. But by making them even more rich and giving them more opportunities to make money, we create a more powerful monster which will undermine our democratic structures even more. We already see this in some of the countries where the organized crime cartels are more powerful than the state. And we risk to create the same monster if we continue to go along the same path.
Mm-hmm. And just how bad do you think the problem is, for instance, in our part of the world, in Antwerp specifically? Because we were talking about Barthewevre. How far does it go right now?
I think it's already going quite far because the war on drugs, as it was reinvented 8 or 9 years ago, has created new opportunities for organized crime groups. And you can already see the indications. These groups are competing for market shares. They are trying to intimidate each other. They are trying to lead the focus from the police forces to the competitors so that they can continue and upscale their operations. And I do think that these groups are already undermining some of the economic sectors in Antwerp and in the rest of Belgium.
By infiltration in the legal part.
By infiltrating, obviously, black money always has to be reinvested in the white economy. has always been the case. So all the money made with drug production and drug supply and drug dealing has to be reinvested, money laundered and reinvested in wide economic sectors. So that's why there are restaurants, why there are businesses, why there are buildings bought by these families and these groups, etc. So it's already happening.
Couldn't you argue that it's good for the GDP of a country?
Yes, but I prefer a sound and healthy economy and not an economy which seems healthy, but which is actually run by straw people for organized crime groups.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk also about the small people, the little helpers, as you could call them, these young gang recruits with no future who provide, in fact, what they are doing is providing for their families through criminal activity, but they need to live as well. So in the transition to a legal model or a regulated model, what to do with these people? How do you convert their activity into something honorable?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that we need to do is to make a difference between different types of drug-related crime. Because now we often think, and also the legal system thinks about drug-related crime as one container concept, which includes the use and the possession of drugs, the buying of drugs, but also the street dealing and the low-level dealers that are involved in the trade. And then there's people that commit all kinds of crimes just to finance their drug habit or their drug consumption pattern, etc. And there is the investors and the coordinators of the large trafficking operations. I do think that our penal system and our penal law should make a distinction between these types of drug-related crime. As we discussed before, possession and consumption of a drug should not even be in the penal law anymore. But crimes related to street dealing, to low-level involvement in the drug trade, should be punished much less than the very violent drug-related crimes. And the kingpins, the investors, the coordinators. One of the problems that I have with our current approach is that while we wage a war on drugs, in the facts it is basically a war on drug users, drug consumers, and a war on the low-level drug dealers, the ones that are on the bottom, in the bottom of the drug trafficking chain. And we know that this level of people that are involved there are the vulnerable people. These are the have-nots. These are the ones used by the smart people at the top, by the kingpins, by the coordinators. They corrupt them with some easy money. They force them. They entice them, and then once they're in the game, they don't let them leave out of that game. So these are very vulnerable, often economically vulnerable people. You see that in the cannabis market, that farmers who are in financial troubles are approached by organized crime groups to grow cannabis in their barns and etc. These are people who are experiencing financial problems, and then they approach these people to do things for them. Same thing with many of the people in the Antwerp port, the straddler carriers, the people working in the docks in the Antwerp port. The mafia and the organized crime looks for those people who have financial problems. And the ones that are suffering from a divorce or have some gambling debts or whatever, they look for that kind of people, and then they entice them with some easy money. Basically, these are vulnerable people. It also shows, in my opinion, that drug policy should be a part of a much broader policy, a social policy. Much of the problems that we see that feed on social problems. A lot of people who are experiencing social problems are getting into drug-related problems. They start dealing, they start consuming too much, etc. So a lot of people who are excluded from society, who are very vulnerable in society, they are the ones that fall prey to addiction, dependence, low-level dealing, etc., more than other people. So drug policy should be also part of a much broader social policy. We should not have a war on drugs, we should have a war on poverty. We should work on housing, we should work on proper inclusion of groups. Just to give you one terrible example, actually, is our prison system. We lock up, we imprison a large number of people for a very long time in an institution which does not really work on re-socializing, reintegrating people. So people who are already vulnerable and committed crimes and did things that were wrong are sent to institutions which are like the medieval holes in the ground where it threw people in and then tried to forget about them for many years. Our prison system today is like that system. We throw people in there in usually very inhumane conditions, and there is almost no investment and effort in re-socializing, in helping these people to find the way back to society and get integrated. On the contrary, they learn more about what they can do in terms of crime. They get involved with drugs only to survive the prison conditions. So as long as this war on drug translates into a war on the most powerless and vulnerable populations, we actually create the problems of the next generation. And this is another element, of course, of the current debates. If you then legalize and regulate, you have to make sure that the populations that were targeted the most by this war on drugs and that bore most of the burden of criminalization, those that were sent to prison, those that were excluded from society, you have to include them in your regulated market. And this is one enormous danger, that even when a society decides to regulate a market, it then becomes the market of the white-collar business people, upper class businessmen. And again, excluding those pockets of society who were under prohibition, the populations that were targeted the most and were punished the most. Yeah. And so this is an important issue of social equity. And it also relates to, so drug policy also relates to development policy. If we want the supply of cocaine coming from Latin America to here to slow down, we have to find solutions for those poor farmers that have no other means of existence than to produce illegal cocaine. Then we have to find exit strategies for marijuana farmers in the Rif Mountains in Morocco. You cannot just spray their fields and tell them to figure out how to make a living for their families, because there's hundreds of thousands of people who have only one way to survive, and it's to be involved in drug production and drug trafficking. So if you want really to do something about this phenomenon, you have to create much more exit strategies and alternative livelihoods for these populations.